Hey guys, this is your host, Doug Stewart, and if you have been with us since episode 1, I want to thank you for hanging in there with us and being a loyal supporter and a loyal listener. We have so many episodes. I mean, we're in the mid to high 300s right now, depending on which episode you're listening to this little pre-roll for. What we're going to do is we're going to actually re-release a few of the episodes that I would consider maybe our greatest hits, ones that maybe you haven't listened to in a long time because you've been here with us from the beginning, or maybe you haven't actually been here for that long and you haven't had time to go back and re-listen to some of them. So we're going to reissue some of the episodes that were really, I'm going to call them old as in like they were recorded a long time ago, but they're not old in terms of relevancy. And so you'll hear from me as host. You'll also hear from probably Norman Horn as host. We might even have some other special guest hosts depending on what the topic is. So to be sure, we will also be releasing new episodes, but we also wanted to return to some of the classics that we've had. So I'll let you get to this show.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and we are going to talk to the authors of Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk. This is a fantastic book that I recommend for a number of reasons. If you're on social media, this is not going to be news to many of you, but getting into what is grandstanding, how do we do it, how do we see it and call it out, or should we even call it out, is what we're going to talk about today. And I have the authors on with us today.
So I'm Justin Tosi. I'm assistant professor of philosophy at Texas Tech University, where I write about moral, social, political, and legal philosophy.
I'm Brandon Warmke. I'm assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. I mostly work in moral philosophy, moral psychology, social philosophy.
Great, guys. Thanks for joining our podcast today. So when I saw the title of your book and, before it came out and when arrived at my doorstep, I had this idea in my mind about what grandstanding was. And I'll discuss in a little bit what I thought it was and how it relates to some other things. But just give us the lay of the land here. Like, what is grandstanding, so that when we have this conversation or when other people talk about it, they kind of use the term properly?
The very basic, most simple way of thinking about grandstanding is a contribution to public discourse that treats it as a vanity project. So grandstanders are people who engage in discussions of morality and politics primarily because they want to impress people. They want others to think of them as morally enlightened, morally respectable, someone to defer to. The slightly more sort of philosophical definition of grandstanding that we give in the book is basically grandstanding has two parts. Grandstanding is saying something in public discourse. So it could be a Facebook post, maybe a tweet, maybe a stump speech, maybe a cable news monologue. And we call that the grandstanding expression. And the grandstanding expression is just motivated in a significant way by what we call the recognition desire. So people have this desire. They want to impress people. Could be a very general desire, just to be thought of as morally enlightened or the right side of history. Sometimes the desire is a bit more specific. Maybe you want people to think that you care deeply about the poor or about traditional family values. And so those desires for moral recognition are motivating you to say something in public discourse. That's grandstanding. It's a very simple account that we give in the book.
Yeah. So let me give you where I was coming from, as I mentioned earlier. When I think of what happens when people are doing something called virtue signaling, I have in mind the idea that they're looking for recognition that they are virtuous people. And they do that in certain ways. So you actually talk about this a little bit in the book and how virtue signaling is probably not the best word to use for what you're describing. So maybe you can kind of elaborate on that a little bit. And you can tell me that I'm wrong about what my definition of virtue signaling was too.
Yeah, so this is Justin may have something to add here. We started writing about this topic, grandstanding, in 2014. We were both PhD students at the University of Arizona, and it seemed to us that at the time, public discourse was getting more toxic, and it Also seemed to us that one explanation for why it was getting more toxic is that people seem to be using their discussions of morality and politics to show off. And the only term at the time that was in use that we knew of was moral grandstanding. It's a term that actually dates back to the 19th century that has its roots in discussions of baseball. And about a year after we started writing about grandstanding, we noticed people started talking about this term virtue signaling. And that term started gaining traction in 2015, 2016. And so for we've been writing about this topic for 6 years. A lot of responses to our work is, I think, a very common response, and it was your response, which is, this is just virtue signaling. It's an interesting question why that term caught on. I think it sounds more sciencey and maybe technical and impressive. Maybe ironically, the term itself sounds more impressive.
The term virtue signaling?
Yeah, the term virtue signaling sounds impressive. And the reason is because it borrows some terminology from economics and biology and psychology, the apparatus of signaling. So basically, here's what we say about these two terms. I mean, I think when most people use the term virtue signaling, or when they accuse someone of virtue signaling, in the vast majority of cases, what they have in mind is something very close to what we mean by moral grandstanding. I think that's certainly true. It's people using their discussions of morality and politics to show off. I think that's absolutely right. However, as we explain in the book, and I think if we'd written this section now, we'd probably do it a little differently. I mean, we wrote this, we submitted the manuscript over a year ago, actually. The term itself can be very misleading. And here's just a couple of reasons for that. So signaling as just a phenomena in the world is ubiquitous. So you wait in line at the post office and don't cut in front of someone. Well, that signals something about you. Whether you're
or stand 6 feet away.
Or stand 6 feet away. Yeah, that signals something about you. Now, whether you're trying to do it or not, it signals that you're conscientious, right? That you're going to wait for other people, right? That you're someone who can be trusted. And so, signaling, as the term is used in, say, biology or psychology or economics, doesn't pick out what we would describe as an intentional use of language especially to show off how good you are. And that's because signaling doesn't have to use language. So, signaling is ubiquitous, right? It's something that you can do even when you're not thinking about it, when you're not trying, when you don't want to impress people, right? Signaling is just a ubiquitous feature of human social life. What we have in mind with grandstanding is something that is more intentional. And the reason why this gets confused is because people will defend virtue signaling, and they'll say something like, look, how could you possibly think it's wrong to be seen doing something virtuous? And so we don't have a problem. I mean, obviously, we don't have a problem with the mere fact of doing something virtuous in public and being seen, right? That's clearly not what we're focusing in on, with the book. What we have in mind is something like an intentional behavior that is aimed at a certain kind of recognition. And in the book, we go into a number of other problems with the term, but that's, in a way, that's the big one, is that virtue signaling as a term is too broad, and it admits of too much confusion to pick out the very specific kind of linguistic phenomenon that we're interested in.
So the grandstanding aspect would be someone saying, look at my signal.
It isn't that. So it isn't just that you are drawing attention to yourself, although maybe you're more likely to do that if you're grandstanding. What makes it grandstanding is that it's motivated. So like in your own psychology, in your own head, it's motivated by wanting attention. So the place where I think a lot of people go wrong here is they want a phenomenon that they can just like look at a bit of text or see a very short video clip of like any random person and say, aha, that's grandstanding or that's virtue signaling. But it doesn't really work that way in our view. In our view, that's a little bit like trying to just look at a piece of text removed completely from broader context and being able to say, aha, that's lying. Right. So the reason it doesn't work that way is that just like lying, grandstanding has this intentional component. So in order to lie, it isn't just that you have to say something false or mislead someone, you have to do so intentionally. So in order to know whether someone's lying, you need to know what they know. Like, do they actually know that they're saying something false? Are they trying to mislead someone? And it's the same with grandstanding. So you have to know, I mean, not only are they using moral talk, right? They're doing so with this one goal in mind. So sometimes, we might be pretty confident. We can look at a piece of text and say, oh, that's so over the top. What's this person doing? But generally, in order to really be confident, I think you need to know like a lot about the person. You need to know, do they talk this way a lot? Are they very often making moral talk about them? Are they actually a kind of self-promoting person? Because these are the things that will actually give you good evidence of what they're up to when they're engaging in moral talk. So we don't, the thing that drives us maybe the most crazy, or at least me, I shouldn't speak for Brandon, is, people look at this project and they say, well, I mean, this is so ridiculous. These guys are using moral talk to criticize other people for using moral talk. But that's not what we're doing.
Did you actually get that criticism? Like,
yes.
From colleagues?
That's pretty common. It's
the
pretty
go-to,
common.
I thought about this for 10 seconds and I know better than you
Really?
reply.
I never had that thought. I was just... I always thought this is a book analyzing it and being somewhat circumspect about it.
So that speaks well of you.
But that's to your virtue.
How do you, I wanted you to know that, so I guess I just did.
It was one of the very first. It was one of the very first public philosophical criticisms of we wrote this original paper that came out in 2016, and the original criticism of the paper was, well, look at these guys criticizing grandstanding by grandstanding, and they're using moral talk in just the same way that they condemn. Yeah, I mean, the virtue signaling stuff, in a way, like, it's fine. Another reason we avoid the term is because it's become politicized, and then also there's this debate now. Like, hear people talk about vice signaling. So now we're going to get into a discussion about like, oh, they're virtue signaling. And someone says, oh, well, what they're signaling is not actually a virtue. They think it is, but they're actually vice signaling. And now we have this useless discussion about whether someone is actually signaling a virtue and vice. So we think it's just worth avoiding altogether and just talk about people trying to impress others.
So terminology aside, I think that's a really helpful clarification for me, and I appreciate you guys spending time on my podcast telling me where to be more clear in my thinking. And I think the word grandstanding does actually convey what you mean way better, for especially than the reasons you just mentioned. But it does seem to me that this whole thing hinges on understanding somebody's motivation in something. And on the one hand, we would all say, do you if you surveyed everybody in the United States, you could say, probably 100% of people would answer, I believe that moral grandstanding does happen, that some people do it, right? Like 100% would say, well, of course people do it. At the same time, how do you actually know if that's what people are doing? I mean, you used Harvey Weinstein as a sort of example, and it seemed very clear based on what you were saying. But some cases aren't so clear. So there's a lot of ambiguity about whether or not you can even identify it, even though we all know it exists.
Yeah. Yeah, we use three sources of evidence. So one is people just telling us that they've done it. People who say, I used to do this a lot, or I still do this a lot, or it's really a struggle for me. I mean, that actually happens quite a bit. The second source of evidence is general facts about human psychology. So we know that most people think really highly of themselves morally. We know that most people engage in what psychologists call impression management. They want others to think of them as they think of themselves. And we know that status seeking and social comparison are very common human motives that drive a lot of our behavior. It's why people brag. It's why people try to show off in general. And so, our view is like, well, just think about the general human psychology. Like, we know people brag. We know that people are selfish and are often in many areas of their lives narcissistic. It would be a shocking coincidence if moral discussions were the only place this behavior was not common. I mean, that would be like an incredible I mean, that would just be amazing.
It would be really nice.
Second.
Yeah.
It would be amazing. Yeah, it would be amazing in that way too. Yeah. The third source of evidence is that over the past about 3 years, we've conducted 7 studies with over 6,000 participants with a empirical psychologist and colleague of mine, Josh Grubbs. And what we have found is, so we created this grandstanding scale, this motivations for grandstanding. And what we found is grandstanding is quite common. At least grandstanding for certain kinds of social status are very common. And so, yeah, I mean, so I think those 3 things combined, we think provide pretty strong evidence that people grandstand. And in fact, we think that the burden would be on those who deny that it happens. Now, there's an entirely separate question about when to know whether someone's grandstanding and how to identify it. But, as we argue in the book, that's in a way the wrong question to ask.
Shouldn't we want people to think well of us? I mean, it seems to me that some grandstanding could be just sort of a natural part of what it takes to communicate who you are. Like politicians almost can't get around it because, I don't know certain politicians. There's about 3 politicians that I have pretty warm feelings about with respect to like, oh, well, those are, stand-up characters. They voted the way that I would want them to vote. And they're not even people I can even vote for. So, outside of that, I mean, and that's extremely rare to know a politician really well. Like, don't people like politicians need to promote themselves? Or am I not thinking about that quite right?
Yeah. So one of the things that we point out in the book is that, I mean, you're right. Politicians do engage in probably more grandstanding than the average person, or at least they used to. I don't know about it anymore. But they have stronger incentives than we do. So their livelihood is tied up in whether people trust them, whether people think that they represent their values. So when we demand of politicians that they show us that they share our values, that they show us that they're good people, we incentivize them to act in ways that are not really so innocent. So, I mean, we talk about things social problems that come from normal people engaging in grandstanding too, in the book that we can talk more about. But in politics, it ends up being that it isn't just we get politicians, giving stump speeches that refer to values that their constituents like, or that they vote in ways that are consistent with their constituents' values. Those things seem fine. The problem is that we also incentivize politicians to dig in their positions and never compromise. So there's psychological evidence that we punish people really severely, at least in our judgments of them, when they take a moral stance and then change it, at least from our perception of things. So when we encourage politicians to signal, very clearly and strongly what their values are and take very firm moral positions, we make it more difficult for them to compromise when it turns out that we can't get our first choice and they can't get exactly the policy that we want them to get. So we, in other words, are ourselves kind of responsible for the lack of bipartisanship in the U.S. legislature, for instance. Another thing that goes wrong is we make politicians want to support policies that favor in a ham-fisted way our values, that express our values. So just to take a pretty uncontroversial example, especially for maybe your listeners, Doug, rent control. I mean, who doesn't like the idea of people being able to afford housing? So when that becomes a hot button issue, when people are worried that the rent is too high, we get politicians saying, well, of course, I mean, I care about these people who can't make their rent, who are struggling to get ahead in life. We should have rent control. But of course, every student of basic economics knows this is a terrible idea that backfires. What it does is just result in housing shortages and a decline in the quality of housing, because landlords then have no incentive to invest in housing. They have no incentive to, or at least lowered incentive to construct new housing. So what you get then is an expressive policy, so one that signals that the person who favors the policy has a certain value, that doesn't work. So in other words, by incentivizing politicians to do what sounds, on the face of it, like pretty innocent stuff, just show people your heart's in the right place, we get pretty terrible consequences.
It seems like the loop of feedback just makes things worse and worse. I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. And I think it's pretty clear that it happens in politics. But are there other areas that individuals should be sort of concerned? Oh, hey, this is probably happening, at my workplace, or it's not pointing out something that's not so obvious. Facebook, Twitter, social media is, rife with it. But is there ways that we can sort of identify it on less political public areas?
I think one of the places that you probably see a lot of grandstanding, I mean, this is trite, but is on social media. So yeah, suppose you can't tell with much certainty whether someone is grandstanding. It still might be helpful to know in general what it looks like. So, for example, lots of grandstanding takes the form of social pile-ons, especially when the case of someone does something wrong, or maybe does something wrong, and then a bunch of people engage in a social pile-on to show they're on the right side of history. They express their commitment to a value or a tribe by joining in on this massive social pile-on. Some grandstanding takes the form of what we call ramping up in the book, which Doug, you might say, well, actually, you probably wouldn't say this, but you might say something like, if you really care about the poor, we should have a $15 minimum wage. And then I chime in and I say, no, are you kidding? If you really care about justice and the poor, you would support a $20 minimum wage, $20 per hour minimum wage. So there's often grandstanding can take a form of a kind of moral arms race where you have people trying to outdo each other to preserve a vision of themselves and to the group as caring deeply about some value. It often takes the form of what we call trumping up, which is kind of like a hyperactive ethic, or moralizing, where you're sort of looking for things. You're actively looking for things that you can call wrongdoing to accuse people of. So the idea here is that the things that fall below the moral radar of the hoi polloi don't fall below the radar of the astute grandstander. Some grandstanding takes the form of outrage exhaustion. I mean, we know that outrage is a reliable signal of moral convictions. So if you want to signal that you're deeply morally convicted about something, outrage is a perfectly fine way to do that. So grandstanders exploit this sort of social understanding of outrage and what message it sends. And then finally, grandstanders often engage in what we call dismissiveness, where they'll say things like, if you can't see that this is true, then I am not going to explain it to you. Go educate yourself, right?
Yeah, right.
And the implication is that I shouldn't have to explain it to you. And even if I did, you wouldn't understand it because you're so benighted.
Or the really brief one, somebody just does a name and say, look it up.
Yeah, look it up. Yeah,
it's like,
do better.
Yes,
do better. Yeah. So there's a kind of dismissiveness. So those are not foolproof tests, because there are perfectly innocent ways of engaging in moral talk that can resemble each of those ways that grandstanding can be expressed. But I think it can help to give a kind of field guide or roadmap to how grandstanding often looks. I mean, look, you said earlier, do we want people to like us? Isn't it good to be well liked? And I think, it's perfectly fine. And there are more or less innocent ways of wanting to be liked. I mean, you don't go to dinner and be like, brag about your income or brag about where you got your degree or how beautiful your spouse is. I mean, so there are some ways of going about doing things that might lead people to believe that you are trustworthy and a good person. And then there are things that we all find pretty gauche. And our view is that grandstanding is not just gauche, it's not just annoying, but for lots of reasons, it's morally bad and we should avoid it.
Yeah. Okay. Just for example here, I want to know what's happening. So, the whole $15, no, you should do $20 minimum wage. And what my response would be, if you really care about the poor, you would abolish the minimum wage.
Yeah.
What kind of grandstanding would I be doing if that were my response? I'm pretty sure I'm guilty of that.
Well,
not anytime recently, but I probably said that to somebody.
You may not be grandstanding. I mean, you might just be, so there are lots of motivations you might have for engaging in discourse. One of them is you want to help, you care about the truth. Those are perfectly innocent reasons to engage in moral discourse. Now, one motivation you might have is to try to impress other people. Now, if you're talking to a bunch of progressives who really want to raise the minimum wage, they're not going to be impressed, and they may not think very highly of you. And so, it
would be more for shock value in that regard.
Yeah. So there's, our motivations are extremely complex, and not everything that we say in public discourse is going to be grandstanding. That's certainly true.
Yeah.
But look, if you were, palling around with a bunch of libertarians, you could imagine I don't even think that, you can imagine a kind of arms race among libertarians too, where, you imagine some more extreme policies about wage law or
reparations for businesses that have had to pay minimum wage.
Yeah, right.
Oh my word!
There we go.
Seriously, have you heard that, or are you just like?
I haven't, but I'm sure. I will
that's
someday.
A great example.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that when I'm in a grandstanding evening.
There we go.
And I'm on Facebook at 11:30. I'm going to be like, you know what? I'm going to find some way to incorporate reparations for business owners who had to pay minimum wage.
That's really good. Has had enough, folks.
Yeah, right. Well, honestly, that was really kind of the reason I wanted to segue into the whole libertarian thing, because we're sort of like social outcasts. I don't know where you guys are on the political spectrum, and for the conversation, it's not really important. We often, libertarians, want to be seen. We want to be seen as people who have thought through the issues. We want to be seen as people who have actually studied economics, have a little bit of maybe even legitimately more knowledge about rent control or minimum wage laws or open borders or whatever it might be. And so it's sometimes difficult to not grandstand by inserting ourselves into a conversation that people are having that is not an intra-libertarian one. And so one of the reasons I really enjoyed your book was that it isn't just about pointing fingers at the people doing the grandstanding. It's also about, and you don't it's not like a guide, a personal, self-help guide, but it's more like, hey, we all do it. And for me, I'm a little bit more self-reflective, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I do this. I've done this in the past 2 weeks while I was reading your book. And I'm like, I'm guilty of this. And so, I don't know. This is why it's a really relevant topic. And so I would want my listeners to know that this book isn't about how do we, point out the grandstanding of other people, because we can all go to that most improved unit, and that's ourselves. And let's become better, moral talkers.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, Doug. One thing that Brandon and I have remarked upon is that, a very common reaction we get when we tell people that we're working on this is they want to know, all right, how do I find these people? I want to get them, I want to be able to spot grandstanders and call them out and shame them into stopping.
You just have to say the enemy is within.
Yeah, right. So, but that's just it. So it's funny that you had this reaction, because it's really unusual in our experience for people to read this and think oh my God, what have I been doing? I this, this describes if I really look at myself in, the cold light of day, this is very often how I engage in public moral talk. So you're right. One of the things that we really want people to do is to try to be honest with yourself. Ask yourself, look, if I say this thing and nobody thinks any better of me, so they don't think I'm morally an impressive person, or maybe if you're worried about some folks in the libertarian circle, what if they don't think I'm really smart because of this or anything like that? So you can grandstand in that way too. It's not moral grandstanding, but still a similarly worrisome process. If you ask yourself, if I got no recognition for this, would I be disappointed? Would I feel well, what was the point? Then you should probably be worried, right? Maybe you think, I should sit this one out because I'm not in this for the right reason. I'm not actually trying to help anybody. What I care about, maybe a little bit too much, is how I look and how this will help serve my reputation.
Yeah. Yeah, there's somebody listening out there to this episode who gets on Facebook or Twitter every day or every other day or at some point and says, how can I impress other people? How can I get on there and debate people and win them over and show them how much I know? And so I really hope that this discussion and then your book will kind of help us sort of recognize that in ourselves.
Are you throwing subtle shade at your editor again?
Yeah.
No.
Hint, hint.
Hint, hint.
Sorry, I
Just
didn't
Mark
mean to mess that up for you.
Todd, and you like start listening, like listing your listeners. It's like,
Yeah.
So this is
I
for
wish
you
I had
guys.
a list of all my listeners because then I could write to them and tell them thank you. One thing that I think social media has done is it's made it easy for us to behave like politicians, in the sense that we have a platform. Because anybody can get on. I mean, you quoted somebody who put on Twitter, it's like, it's crazy that, I can type something in this box that could ruin my life. And I was like, very few places in most books do I pause and like ponder something, but this was one of those places. I was like,
yeah,
holy cow, that's a very it's very insightful.
Mm-hmm.
And social media has changed things. And I don't think for the better. And what's interesting is that we all complain about how terrible social media is, yet we're all part of it. The people who complain about it that I hear are on social media talking about, Twitter's a dumpster fire and Facebook. Oh man, I just ignore the arguments on Facebook and this and that. And, everybody uses social media for different reasons, not just for discussing moral talk. But how has that changed? I mean, have you over the past, let's see, you said you started in about 2014. So in the past 6 years, have you observed an evolution of things, of phenomenon happening in this regard?
I think I think it's gotten worse even since we started writing about the topic in 2014. I mean, one of the things that we point out in the book, in the preface, is that grandstanding itself is not, I think on reflection, this is obvious. It's not a new phenomenon. The drive for status and to impress other people, that's a very basic human drive. And I think maybe some cultures are able to sublimate that better than others. But I think, at least in our culture, the drive is almost always there for a lot of us. And I think what social media has done, just think about 100 years ago, 50 years ago, to have an audience of 10 people, 50 people, you'd have to stand on the street corner, go to a Kiwanis meeting, be a pastor, be a celebrity or be a politician. Like that's basically the only way that you could have an audience of more than 100 people. Now, any random person can get on Twitter or Facebook and talk to hundreds or thousands or millions of people. And I think, so it's easier to have a platform and more people have a platform. So you have this like basic psychological hunger for status. And then you have more people on platforms. You're just easier to grandstand and it's harder to avoid it. I even think back to, so this dates me a little bit. So let's see, I was in college before Facebook and MySpace, but I remember the beginning of Facebook and then even towards the end of MySpace. Like if you think back, I don't know how old you are, Doug, but you think back to those times, like I don't remember anyone on MySpace talking about George Bush. I just don't remember. it. And maybe it was there.
Maybe they should have, and MySpace would still be around.
Maybe. Yeah, nobody had Frederick Douglass in their top 8.
Right. And even the early days of Facebook. If you look back to your Facebook posts, if you were to go do this for whatever reason, surely it happened, but it was not like people were posting 10 times a day about the president. But, I have lots of academic friends who are like every day, it's like 6 posts about Trump. And, so I think even it's something has changed in the culture, even just in the past 15 years. And even I think since 2014, I think Justin and I realized back then, to sort of toot our own horn a little bit, I think we were ahead of the curve. Some of the early responses to our paper was like, okay, it's a problem, but like, what are these guys really on about? But now it's like, it's probably hard to find someone who doesn't think this is a serious problem and that discourse is not toxic.
Yeah. Your experience is very similar to mine. I finished college before Facebook was, probably before Zuckerberg was in college. I don't know, around that time. But anyway, a lot of the new phenomenon online, all these platforms that people could be part of, social media and stuff, were very much a new thing. And people were all about, what is it? And how do we sort of shape it? They weren't individually thinking that, but that's sort of like the net experience. Whereas now there's, people get on Facebook now, like newcomers. Oh yeah, I just signed up on Facebook, and they're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea about, how terrible my friends were or something like that. I'm just exaggerating
Who's signing
here.
up for Facebook? How old are these people?
This is a very random aside, but you know what's funny is if you go to facebook.com and you're not logged in, it's got a big thing splash screen there on signing up. And I'm like, isn't everybody signed up by now? Like,
yeah.
It's like this little tiny thing at the top that's like sign in. And I'm like, yeah, sign up is really the largest part of your page right now.
20-year-olds are not signing up for Facebook. I don't think.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
My freshman our freshman students are just not on Facebook. They're on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. Yep. Maybe Twitter, but they're not on Facebook. I mean, Facebook is something your parents or grandparents do. It's not. Yeah. I don't know who's 20 and signing up for Facebook, but
yeah,
I used to think I would care. Young people getting like fake Facebook accounts that they use to like throw their parents off of the actually like fun and bad things that they're doing. But that's about all. That's about all I've heard of younger.
That's pretty much. Account. Oh my word!
Yeah, just for show.
That's crazy.
It's actually pretty clever.
Yeah.
All right. My kids are not quite there yet, so I'm gonna hang on. Let me write this down.
Don't give them any ideas.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me is as we're having this conversation, we're all saying, hey, everybody kind of notices that it's happening. And of course, politicians have always done it. It's just the nature of the beast or whatever. What's amazing to me is that apparently it works or does it? Like, people are still taken in by these ideas of people showing off themselves. So, like, is it really working, or is it just making things worse and it feels like it's working, but it's actually really harming us, or both?
I mean, I think it is a bit of both. I think you're exactly right, Doug. There are psych studies showing that plausibly, like, the reason that we hate hypocrites so much is that when someone makes a moral claim, we expect them to like believe it and abide by it. So if we've come to find out that if someone is throwing around a bunch of moral heavy artillery, but they don't actually direct it at themselves, they do whatever they want. People come to feel sort of hoodwinked by this person. They think, what is this guy doing? Like he's giving off the signal that he is on the vanguard of respecting women or whatever. And turns out not so much. But then interestingly, if people preface their moral claims with, look, I'm not perfect. I failed in this myself. But I think this is the right thing. People are not so bothered by this when they see this person failing to abide by the claim, the moral claims that they subject everyone else to. So I think it's just natural for us to think that when someone makes a moral claim, like it's deeply felt for them, they're motivated by it.
Yeah. So this is one really nice question, and I think this is one question that's right for empirical research. I mean, so does grandstanding work? Yes and no. So depends obviously on the case. I mean, so why might you think grandstanding works? Well, there's a kind of background assumption in social life that people are as they present themselves to be. And so if someone is presenting themselves in a certain way, there's a kind of default presumption that they are who they say they are. So if someone presents themselves as caring deeply for the poor, there's a kind of default presumption in favor of that being true. So that's why you might think grandstanding works. But there are, I think, criteria or maybe things that can affect the situation that determine whether your grandstanding works. So one of them is, as Justin pointed out, if people already know that you're not a great person, your grandstanding is not going to be effective. So, in the book, we talk about this letter from Harvey Weinstein after he got accused of all this terrible stuff. He goes on about how he cares about women and blah, blah, blah. No one was taken in by the act. I mean, from the political right to the left, no one was impressed by this. And it's because we all knew it was baloney, right? He was just grandstanding. The other thing that can determine whether your grandstanding is successful or not is who your audience is. So one of the clearest examples of this, and we discussed this in the book, is a Golden Globe speech that Meryl Streep gave a few years ago in part about Trump, where she said, she begins by saying, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, I lost my voice in screaming and lamentation this week." And if you look at like left Twitter and like celebrity responses, like everyone in the room, I mean, Meryl Streep is a broad to be emulated when, one celebrity tweeted, she's amazing, right? And you look at the response from the right, and they were like, oh, she's just grandstanding, of course she wasn't screaming in lamentation that week. So I think depending on who you are, I think you're more inclined to be taken in by someone's grandstanding if they agree with you, right? If they're part of your tribe.
One thing that I've often thought about when it comes to language, whether it's biblical interpretation or interpreting just anybody speaking or writing, is what is being meant by what is being said and like what's being implied. And when we use speech, we're not just writing words, we're not just saying words, we're actually doing something. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss out on is, and we don't actually not catch it. We just don't analyze language that way very, very often, where when someone is saying something, take Trump, for instance, there was something that he said a couple of weeks ago, and I think it had to do with businesses or the shutdown or whatever. And in context, apparently he was telling a joke that just tended to fall flat. And when I saw it in the first headline of that, I was a little, maybe not outraged, but like a little like, what? He said that? Really? And then when I actually went and looked at it, I was like, oh, he was telling a joke that didn't work. And so it's a very different thing to literally quote somebody versus, oh, if you heard them, it would either come off differently or in a different context, you kind of realize that they're kind of doing something with their speech, whether it's motivation or whether it's like encouraging somebody or whatever it might be. So it seems like context plays a big role in whether we're identifying grandstanding or not.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in the book is that grandstanders rarely do you see someone like in public discourse just come out and say something like, I care the most about the poor. Or of all of you, I care the most about this country. I mean, you might see that, but it's very rare. And the reason is because that kind of obvious self-promotion is both transparent and widely agreed to be gauche, right? That's just not how you talk about things. So what grandstanders do is they use this indirect language. So indirect language is where, as you point out, there's like what you say and there's what you imply. So, a police officer pulls you over, gives you a ticket, and you say, officer, isn't there some other way that we could deal with this? And now, strictly speaking, you're just asking, is there another way to deal with this? But what's being implied is, would you be willing to take a bribe? So this kind of indirect speech is ubiquitous. And one reason we engage in ubiquitous speech is to hide our true intentions and to have plausible deniability. And this is what grandstanders do. And this is why grandstanding is so hard to detect often, is because if you simply look at what someone says without context, without knowing what's in their head, it's often innocent. I mean, it might be hyperbolic, but it's often, morally upright. It's on all fours, seems fine. But what often grandstanders are doing is they're manipulating language in this way because they know that if they just came out and said what they wanted from other people, people's alarms would go off.
Yeah, right. So are you guys optimistic about the future? I mean, is your book is out now, and it's too early to tell whether or not it's going to change the tide. But like what are the prospects here? Like, how do we even change this tide, if you will?
Yeah, good. So one thing that maybe the main thing that we stress is this isn't a problem that is best addressed by tackling grandstanding head on. So you shouldn't go around trying to identify grandstanders and then accusing them, blaming them of grandstanding, because then the discussion just turns into exactly what they want. Just a debate that's about whether they're good people, and people will generally give them the benefit of the doubt, and then they'll get the recognition that they crave. So don't go around blaming people. Instead, you should work on yourself. So as I said earlier, ask yourself, if I say this thing that I'm thinking about saying, am I trying to help other people? Am I actually trying to help other people get at the truth or to behave better? Or am I hoping that people will think better of me? And, if you kind of find that, actually I am kind of just hoping that I get a bunch of likes from this, then probably keep your thoughts to yourself and maybe find some better way to direct your energy. Go actually do something that is constructive and positive in the world that really does help other people. Now, as to your point about whether we should be optimistic, what Brandon and I kind of hope for is that grandstanding will eventually come to be seen as just gauche, or just something that's kind of shameful and embarrassing. Like, oh God, like we know what you're doing. Like, come on, don't do it. Or even better yet, that people, lay awake thrashing in bed and like, oh, why did I say that? It was so, like some of us do about everything. So, you might sort of look at the way things are and think this is impossible. But I think we actually could get to a point where people regard grandstanding as shameful. So if we just don't give people the attention that they want, then they might come to see it as just not worth bothering, because it's embarrassing when you say something and don't get a bunch of likes. So the thing that we like to tell people is, if you look at etiquette guides from the Middle Ages, you'll see things like, don't blow your nose into the tablecloth. Don't gnaw on a bone of meat and then put it back in the serving dish with the rest of the meat. Things that like maybe someone told you something like this when you were like 3 or 4 years old, right? And at the time, this is written for educated people who are like entering high society, who have reason to want to get these things right. And now it's just commonplace. So the lesson to take from this, the hopeful lesson, is that these are things that maybe to people at the time looked like we're never going to get all these idiots on the same page about not doing these things.
Back into the serving
right? Because it's like, why wouldn't I? Right? I mean, I've got a thing in my hand. I don't want it. Like, I'm just going to put it, the easiest place. Right? I got to blow my nose. I got
to wipe my mouth on my shirt. I got a tablecloth.
Exactly. Yeah. So it took probably actually didn't take hundreds of years. But, at least hundreds of years later, it's like unthinkable that you would see people behaving in any of those ways in any civilized setting. So, hey, we might not know exactly how to get there with grandstanding, but norms do change. And they can in cases of how we use moral talk, just like they can in matters of table manners.
Well, you've certainly set yourself up for never knowing whether or not you're succeeding.
Yeah,
because we're dealing with your great grandkids.
Yeah.
We kind of like it that way.
To shield ourselves from these things.
Yeah. That's okay. I think the more people we try to influence, I mean, not just improve ourselves, but improve the people around us that are sort of within our sphere of influence that doesn't require grandstanding to influence. Like for me, my kids, right? We always say no one likes to show off. I don't often have to tell my kids that because they're introverts just like me. And so, we don't quite have that problem in my family, but I was told that as a kid around other people. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate this conversation. I had a blast. And if people want to find you online, or do you blog anywhere? Is there online location to locate either of you?
At an undisclosed location on Twitter. I tweet. I'm at Brandon Warmke. We do have a blog at Psychology Today, but we rarely post there. Justin's on Twitter too.
Cool.
Yeah, on Twitter's good.
So we will stalk you and make sure that you're not grandstanding. We'll call you out on it. How about that?
Yeah, that's the trick with giving people your Twitter handle after you talk about grandstanding. It's like, man, I really got to be careful now.
Under the microscope.
Well, right. But what the thing is like they're going to have to like go back and look at how you tweet throughout history before they even call you out on it. So, they can't just pick and choose.
Yeah, got to read it all.
I've often wondered that, we have this part of the book where we say don't call people out, that people are thinking that we said that so that we don't get accused ourselves of grandstanding. It's kind of... But anyway.
Well, that kind of goes back to what we just said. It's like, well, what exactly are you trying to communicate by saying that? Not just don't ever do it. Like you're trying to say, don't be the kind of person who's not going to succeed anyway at calling people out on it. Like that's one, not going to work. And second, don't be that guy.
Yeah. Don't be that guy.
Right.
Or gal.
Good all-purpose advice.
Yep. Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah, this is really great, Doug.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.